All right, strap in. We're diving into the last lap of our CompTIA plus 220 1101 exam prep deep dive.
Yeah.
And this time, it's all about hardware and network troubleshooting,
Right.
which, let's be honest, is where things get really interesting.
Absolutely.
This is where we take all that knowledge, all those concepts, and turn them into action.
It's like being a tech detective, you know? You're ready to solve any hardware or network mystery that comes your way.
Okay, I love that analogy. But I gotta admit, I'm both excited and a little nervous.
I hear you.
So, to crack these tech cases, we need a solid plan of attack.
For sure.
What's the first thing we need to master?
Troubleshooting methodology. Think of it as our detective's handbook, right?
Right.
And the CompTIA 6-step process, that's our go-to guide.
6 steps. That sounds a little intense.
It's not as bad as it sounds. It's just about approaching problems systematically.
Okay, that makes sense.
So let's say your computer suddenly shuts down out of nowhere.
Uh,
The first step is identifying the problem. When does it happen? What programs are running? What were you doing when it crashed?
so it's like gathering clues before jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. You don't want to just assume it's a dead power supply without looking at the bigger picture.
Right, right.
Then you move on to establishing a theory, testing it, and so on.
Makes sense. So if I see an exam question that's like, a user reports their computer's running slow, what's the first step? The answer is about getting more info right.
Spot on. Don't fall for those answers that suggest immediate action without really understanding the problem.
Got it. No jumping to conclusions. We got to investigate.
All right, ready to tackle some real-world scenarios.
Let's do it. Bring on the hardware headaches.
First up, the heart of the matter. Motherboards, RAM, CPUs, and, of course, power issues.
Okay, so if a computer's acting really strange, like overheating, random shutdowns, that kind of thing, could it be a motherboard issue?
It's definitely a possibility. Motherboards are like the central nervous system of a computer.
Right.
So any issues there can cause some pretty bizarre behavior.
So if we're talking about those exam scenarios,
Yeah.
what kind of questions should we be prepared for?
They might describe a symptom like a computer won't post, that's power on self-test, or it makes a weird series of beeps when you try to start it.
Oh, like those BIOS beep codes?
Exactly. Those beeps can indicate a problem with the motherboard or other essential components.
Okay, so beeps mean bad news.
Not always, but they're definitely a sign to investigate further. Each beep code can mean something different.
Right.
So you might need to consult the motherboard's manual to really decipher the code.
Good to know. Now, what about RAM? Those modules seem so small, but I bet they can cause big problems.
Absolutely. RAM is like a computer's short-term memory. If it's not working properly, everything slows down.
Yeah, I've been there.
And one thing they love to ask about on the exam is CAS latency, or CL for short.
CAS latency, that sounds pretty technical.
It's simpler than it sounds. Think of CAS latency like RAM's reaction time.
Right?
Lower CL equals faster performance. But here's a catch. All the RAM modules in a system need to have the same CL to work together seamlessly.
So it's like a synchronized swimming team. Everyone needs to be in sync.
Exactly. If you have mismatched RAM timings, it can lead to system instability, errors, all sorts of headaches.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the CPU itself? What kind of exam questions might we see related to that?
They might describe a scenario like a user reports their computer is overheating and shutting down even after cleaning the dust out.
Oh, that's never a good sign.
Right. That could point to a failing CPU cooler or even a problem with the CPU itself.
So it's not always just dust bunnies causing trouble.
Nope. And they might ask you about different CPU sockets and how to install a CPU correctly, that kind of thing.
Okay, that's good to know. What about power problems? What should we be on the lookout for?
One common scenario is a computer that just won't turn on at all.
Oh, I've been there. Is it a dead power supply? Is it something else entirely?
Exactly. It could be a bunch of things. And of course, always make sure the power cord is actually plugged in.
Right. Always start with the basics.
But you'll also need to know how to test the power supply using a multimeter.
Good call.
So make sure you brush up on your multimeter skills.
And speaking of power, what about those tiny little CMOS batteries on the motherboard?
Ah, yes. Those little guys are crucial. They keep the BIOS settings and the system clock running even when the computer is off.
Even though they're tiny?
Right. A dead CMOS battery can cause all sorts of weird issues, like the system clock resetting every time you reboot.
It's like a tiny battery with a big job.
Exactly. I bet the exam might ask about that.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
They might describe a situation where the date and time are wrong. Even after you reset them in the BIOS, that's a classic sign of a failing CMOS battery.
Wow. So many potential pitfalls and solutions.
Well,
Okay, so we've covered the motherboard, RAM, CPU, and power issues.
We've covered a lot.
What's next?
Let's talk storage. HDDs, SSDs, SSHDs.
Ah, yes, the wonderful world of data storage. What do we need to know to ace these questions on the exam?
Be prepared to compare and contrast different storage types. You might ask which drive type would be most appropriate for, say, a video editor who needs super fast performance.
SSDs are blazing fast, so that seems like the obvious choice.
You're right, but you also need to consider capacity and cost.
Right, of course.
SSDs are still more expensive per gigabyte than traditional HDDs.
Good point. It's all about finding the right balance for the situation.
Exactly.
What else about storage drives could come up on the exam?
RAID, for one.
Ah, RAID. Always a fun one.
Be ready to explain the ins and outs of different RAID levels and why we use them.
Okay.
For instance, you might get asked, you need a RAID configuration that prioritizes redundancy to prevent data loss. Which RAID level is most suitable?
Redundancy. That means having a backup, right? So wouldn't that be RAID 1, mirroring?
You got it. It's all about understanding those core concepts.
This is really starting to make sense. What's next on our hardware troubleshooting journey?
Let's dive into the world of displays and projectors, where things can get a little dim, you could say.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Let's illuminate those issues.
Welcome back. Before we took a look at storage, now we get to shed some light, literally, on troubleshooting displays and projectors.
All right, let's brighten things up. What's the first thing we should check if a monitor decides to go dark on us?
It seems obvious, but you always start with the physical layer.
Of course.
Is the monitor plugged in? Are the cables securely connected?
Right.
And then check the input source, too.
Ah, good point.
Sometimes it's as simple as someone accidentally switching to the wrong HDMI port or something.
Right, because those inputs can be tricky, especially with laptops that have HDMI DisplayPort, mini DisplayPort. It can get confusing. What if everything's plugged in, everything seems right, but we're still in the dark?
Then we got to dig a little deeper.
Okay.
First, check the display settings on the computer itself. Maybe the resolution got messed up or something.
Oh, yeah, that happens.
And don't forget about drivers.
Ah, drivers. The root of all evil.
Right. Outdated or corrupted graphics drivers can cause all sorts of weird display problems.
So it's always a good idea to check for those driver updates.
Absolutely. Now think about those exam scenarios. Picture this. A user reports their laptop screen is flickering. What should you check? Think about it. What are the possible culprits?
Flickering. Could be a loose cable.
Could be.
Or maybe the backlight's going bad.
Possibly.
Or maybe even that inverter that powers the backlight.
Exactly. It could be any of those things. So you got to use your detective skills.
Right.
Remember those troubleshooting steps. Identify the problem, test your theory.
Right, of course.
You've got this.
All right, I'm feeling more confident already. Now, projectors, those are a whole other world, right?
They can be, yeah. But the same basic troubleshooting principles apply. Start with the basics. Is it plugged in?
Always a good start.
Is the lens cap off?
You'd be surprised how often that happens.
Oh, I know it. But seriously, common projector issues, we're talking things like dim images, blurry projections, overheating, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so let's play detective again. Dim image. What are we thinking?
Could be the bulb.
The bulb.
Yeah, projectors have a limited bulb life, just like old-fashioned light bulbs.
All right, they don't last forever.
They don't. Or it could be a dirty lens dust is the enemy.
The silent killer of electronics. Okay, what about a blurry image? What's that all about?
That's often just an adjustment issue.
Okay.
The projector lens might be out of focus, or the projector itself might not be positioned correctly.
Got it. Check the focus, check the positioning.
Exactly.
Now, overheating projectors seem prone to that, especially in those stuffy conference rooms.
You're right, and overheating can be a real problem.
Yeah, could damage the projector.
Exactly. So what do? Ensure proper ventilation, check if the fan is running, and never, ever block the air vents.
Solid advice. Okay, we've covered displays, we've talked about projectors, but now it's time to troubleshoot the smaller screens that rule our lives, mobile devices.
Ah, yes. Smartphones and tablets, those have their own unique set of challenges, don't they?
They really do.
Battery issues are a big one.
Yeah, like a phone that only stays charged for 5 minutes. Been there.
We've all been there. The exam might ask, what are some common causes of short battery life on mobile devices?
Okay.
So, you'll need to know about things like demanding apps running in the background, high screen brightness.
Right.
And of course, as batteries age, they just don't hold a charge like they used to.
It's a fact of life. Batteries don't last forever. But what if a device just won't charge at all? What are we doing then?
Then we got to investigate.
Put on our detective hats again.
Exactly. Check the charging port. Is there any debris in there? Test with a different cable and make sure you're using the right adapter.
Oh, the adapter, yeah.
You don't want to use a low amperage charger. It might take forever to charge your device.
That reminds me, I always panic when I see that notification about slow charging.
It's usually not a big deal, just a safety feature if the phone detects an incompatible charger.
Oh, okay.
But it's always best to use the chargers and cables that are recommended by the device manufacturer.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
What about cracked screens? Those are a whole other level of panic.
Tell me about it. And they're so common.
They are.
So if you come across a cracked screen, you'll need to assess the damage and figure out what the options are, repair or replacement most likely.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about touch screen issues? Sometimes my phone doesn't register my touch, especially around the edges. It's so frustrating.
That could be the digitizer acting up.
The digitizer.
Yeah, that's the component that senses your touch.
Okay, right.
So they might ask, what could cause that inconsistent touch response on a mobile device?
And the answer would be
A failing digitizer.
a failing digitizer. Got it. This is all making sense, I gotta say. But let's be honest, no matter how tech-savvy we are, some devices will always strike fear into our hearts.
Oh, tell me about it.
And for me, those are printers.
Printers. The bane of our existence.
Right. But even those mysterious machines, they can be tamed with the right knowledge, right?
That's what we're here for.
All right, let's print some knowledge. Where do we begin our printer troubleshooting adventure?
Just like with everything else, we start with the fundamentals.
Welcome back. Last time we were talking about printers, those mysterious machines that seem to cause so much trouble.
It's true, printers can be tricky, but like we've been saying, it's all about having a systematic approach.
Right. Break it down step by step.
Exactly. Just like with any device, start with those fundamentals.
Okay, so back to basics. What's the first thing we check when a printer's acting up?
Is it plugged in?
Of course, of course.
Is there paper in the tray?
Always check the paper.
Are there any error messages on the printer's display? You'd be surprised how often it's something simple like that.
It's easy to overlook the simple stuff. Let's say we've done all that and the printer's still giving us grief.
Okay.
What's next?
Next, we got to figure out, is it a local printer connected directly to the computer, or is it a network printer?
Ah, so the type of connection matters.
It does, because it changes our next steps.
Okay, walk me through those scenarios.
So if it's a local printer,
Okay.
check the connection, make sure that USB cable is securely plugged in, both ends.
Right, those USB cables can be a pain.
They can. A loose cable can cause all kinds of communication problems.
While we're at it, maybe try a different USB port, just in case.
Good point. Sometimes that's all it takes. Now, if it's a network printer, things get a little more complicated.
Okay.
We need to make sure that the printer is properly connected to the network.
Right, that it can actually talk to the computers that need to use it.
Exactly. And that there aren't any other communication issues going on.
Okay, time to put on our network detective hats again. Where do we begin?
First things first, check if the printer has a valid IP address.
Ah, the IP address. That's how devices on a network find each other.
Exactly. You can usually find the printer's IP address on the printer's control panel somewhere,
Okay.
often in the network settings.
So we're looking for an IP address that makes sense within the network, right?
Yeah.
What if the IP address is missing or it looks kind of fishy?
That could be a problem with DHCP. That's the service that automatically assigns IP addresses on a network.
Right, of course, DHCP.
You might need to configure a static IP address for the printer.
A static IP address so it has a permanent address on the network.
Exactly.
That sounds a bit advanced. Is that something they'd expect us to know for the exam?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding those basic network configurations, that's crucial for troubleshooting printers, especially network printers.
Good to know, good to know. Okay, let's say the printer has a valid IP address. What's our next move?
We need to test connectivity.
Okay.
Remember that ping command we talked about earlier?
The ping command.
Yeah, it's a great way to see if a computer can actually communicate with the printer over the network.
Right, it's like sending a little "Hey, are you there?" message.
Exactly. And if the ping test works, if it's successful,
Yeah.
it means the devices can talk to each other.
Okay.
If not, well, then we have to investigate further, figure out what's blocking communication.
Could be the network cables.
Could be.
Could be a firewall blocking things.
Yeah.
Could even be a problem with how the printer's set up on the network.
Lots of possibilities.
So many possibilities. This is why I love and sometimes hate troubleshooting. Okay, what about those dreaded printer error messages?
Oh, yes.
Any advice for deciphering those cryptic codes?
Sometimes those error messages feel like a foreign language.
They really do.
Honestly, the best thing you can do is consult the printer's manual or the manufacturer's website.
Okay.
They usually have troubleshooting guides that explain what those error codes mean.
So always check the documentation. It's tempting to just Google the error, but the manufacturer's info is usually the most accurate.
For sure.
Now, besides connectivity problems and error messages, what other common printer problems should we be prepared for on this exam?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of things. Paper jams, obviously.
The classic paper jam.
You might need to know how to clear a jam from different parts of the printer, the paper tray, the rollers, maybe even inside the printer itself.
And then there's the mess of ink or toner cartridges.
Exactly. Inkjet printers, you might run into clogged print heads, which usually need to be cleaned.
Right.
Laser printers, you might need to troubleshoot toner cartridge issues, the imaging drum, the fuser unit, all sorts of things.
It's like printers have a whole ecosystem of things that can go wrong. Any tips for tackling these hardware-specific issues?
It all comes down to understanding the different types of printers and how they work.
Okay.
If you know how inkjets and laser printers operate, what their key components are, what commonly goes wrong, it'll give you a huge advantage on the exam.
It's about connecting the symptoms to the technology.
Exactly. Like if you see a question describing a laser printer that's producing really faded prints, what comes to mind?
Well, it could be that the toner cartridge is worn out.
Could be.
Or maybe there's something wrong with the transfer roller.
Exactly.
It's amazing how much ground we've covered in this deep dive.
It has been a journey.
From motherboards and RAM to those tiny mobile devices and those always interesting printers.
We've covered it all.
We really have explored a whole world of hardware and network troubleshooting.
We've only just scratched the surface, really.
But still, I feel like with this knowledge and with that systematic approach to problem solving, anyone listening can conquer that CompTIA A+220 1101 exam.
That's right. And remember, practice makes perfect.
Practice, practice, practice.
Don't be afraid to get hands-on, experiment, maybe even break things safely, of course.
Right, safety first.
The more you troubleshoot in a safe environment, the more confident you'll become.
That's great advice. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of hardware and network troubleshooting.
It's been my pleasure.
We're rooting for you as you prepare for that CompTIA Plus exam. And remember, the learning, it never stops.
Never stop learning.
Until next time, keep those tech skills sharp.